Chapter 9, Galantos 4. Lieutenant Ashka squealed. "What is it?" I failed to keep my voice free of any bafflement, but in this moment it was well warranted. I was aboard the Escapade, the former Sea-Rook flagship. The time it had spent as a makeshift freighter and passenger liner had done little to hide its alien origins, inhuman design philosophies evident at every turn. I had to wonder if this did not have some part to play in the ongoing unrest aboard the vessel, its hostile and bizarre architecture increasing the discomfort of the passengers and pushing them over the edge into riotous dissent. Or it could be something with them being packed into a warship like canned fish and provided the bare minimum necessities. Commander Thorne had been given a scant force of Navy troopers initially intended to keep an eye on the other alien species, the Pwek as they called themselves. The arrival of the Bakurans had put a strain on that, but the presence of their own Imperial forces would keep them in order. That was what Thorne claimed to have hoped in any case, but my detour and the arrival of mining guild refugees alongside a small horde of epicanthics had vastly overstretched Thorne's means. Both he and Tullius had grossly downplayed the situation here, but in this chaos there was an opportunity. I felt a greater degree of pity for these poor souls than I had the Bakurans, and so urged Mob to redeploy some of his newly armed Navy troopers to quell the unrest and break up the gangs, all without resorting to mass execution. It was that last part I emphasized most heavily. Tullius wanted Mob to exercise restraint, and this was the kleptomaniac colonel's chance to prove he was capable of that much. This detour was a distraction from the ongoing operation, overseen by one of Mob's lackeys, as I had made an offhand mention to Thorne about the need of a quiet and untraceable mode of communication. Thorne then spoke to Captain Con Doruggan, who had a potential answer to my problem. Doruggan was one of the refugees from Bakura, an Imperial officer caught in the middle of the Bakuran insurrection and Mob's pacification of the capital. He was swept up in the aftermath, or so the captain told it, and ended up on the Escapade. His reluctance to go into any detail on what he was doing or where he was during the arrest of Narus was noteworthy, but the captain had been instrumental in maintaining what peace there was on the ship. I decided, at least for the time being, not to pursue answers and instead focus on his offer. Doruggan, Thorne, a handful of guards and technicians, and I were gathered around a large cylindrical device. It was over 5 times as long as I was tall, its body covered in dull grey durasteel plating. One side was flat, with a red line indicating its sensor suit. Unsurprisingly, the other side held 6 small conical engines for propulsion. I might have mistaken it for a missile or torpedo of some kind, had it looked like any I had seen before. "It is an elegant series messenger drone," Doruggan explained, stepping aside as a team of technicians approached and hooked a levitating bank of consoles to the device. I had never seen a messenger drone before, at least not in person. The Conqueror did not carry any, even as part of her emergency communications suite in the event the array went down. Since the Conqueror had never left the slice before now, there was never a reason to worry about what our options were. Surely, the 3 backup communications arrays we had would suffice if ever the main one was damaged? But it seems I'm the fool, I thought, bitterly. We should have considered the possibility of a third attempted impressment. There was no point in crying over a lost credit, when there was more to make. While Tullius kept Perret and his ilk distracted, I was supposed to warn Coruscant of the storm headed their way. It was embarrassing how late I realized why Tullius sent me here. He likely already knew about the drone. That then raised the question of why Tullius did not contact the Escapade immediately and have the drone sent out. I did not have a definite answer, but I could theorize. Perret's Confederates were likely listening into our communications. There was neither time nor a need to test if this was the case, in the short term at least, but Tullius believed so. As such, I would operate under the idea that our communications were being listened to as well. That raised the second question: why was Tullius not direct in his orders when pushing me toward the Escapade? The insinuation would be that he did not want anyone to overhear him giving that order, but the reason only became more clear when one considered who aboard the Conqueror would have some issue with Tullius's plan. That led down a far more concerning train of thought: where was the Imperial Security Bureau? I was of no illusion that there were no political officers on the Conqueror. Wherever there was the potential for dissent, there was the ISB. The question was, how did Perret get this far before whatever operatives were near him arranged an accident? It had been days now, and Perret was amassing a force large enough to threaten the core. Could the ISB not reach Perret, or the alternative, that the ISB might be endorsing this action, was a terrifying proposition. My eyes drifted to the officers and technicians that I did not know. Could any of them be ISB plants? Some political enforcer that snuck their way onto the escapade? We were low priority, of course, but the Bureau was a large organization. I was of the idea that probes of this type can only make a single jump. I asked, turning to face Doruggan now, that would place it in Galantos, if I am not mistaken? Galantos was the closest world also on a major hyperlane, which typically meant either better garrisons or modern communications equipment. Our next best option is Prakith, Thorn cut in, arms behind his back as he watched the technicians work, but that would be more distant. Time is of the essence. I fear Captain Tullius's patience will only last so long before he does something drastic. I turned my head sharply to glare at the commander, but Doruggan spoke first. Your captain is certainly a firebrand. Is it true that he murdered the last would-be warlord who tried to recruit him? If rumors are to be believed, yes. Both men turned their eyes on me, as if waiting for me to confirm their suspicions. I opened my mouth, but my knee-jerk response died in my throat as I came to a realization. I did not know what happened to the Roth governor, Rant or whatever his name was. In all of the excitement, I had taken Tullius's arrival at face value and did not have much time to linger on the question afterwards. Tullius had been vague on the details, appearing vaguely discomforted discussing it, perhaps even embarrassed. I had assumed at the time it was merely the situation, stumbling into a trap and being pressed into service by a would-be warlord. Now I viewed his reaction from the perspective of a sudden execution. No, I decided, that does not fit Tullius at all. I took a moment to paint a profile of Tullius's personality in my mind. Tullius was stern, calm under pressure, compassionate when it suited the situation. A toothy grin that looked more like a grimace than anything approaching joy, a mad bloodlust flashing in his eyes as the turbo-laser bolts rend the rebel cruisers apart. A casual, calculating malice as he ordered his section into position, ready to bombard a populated world with the same disregard he would discuss the weather with. A maddened aggression barely concealed beneath the veneer of imperial doctrine, charging his vessels into the middle of an enemy formation, wielding star destroyers like cudgels against his foes. Then again, I thought, that sounds like the exact thing Tullius would do. In the years I had served under Tullius, he had been the picture of imperial discipline, perhaps a little overzealous at times when victory was at hand in wargames or the odd pirate, but the last few months had shown me a new side. It stood to reason that steeped in the cult of aggression as Arrowhead Command was, its membership could be expected to adopt some of its tenets. Yet, despite this revelation, a part of me still rushed to defend Tullius. Yet how I would do so escaped me. To claim that he was not some blindly blood-lusted madman? That he was, in fact, a perfectly calculating blood-lusted madman? Left flailing for something to say, I opted instead to shoot Thorn a glare for his comments and loudly cleared my throat. Gentlemen, perhaps we could focus? Oh, right, of course. So, the probe. The Elegance class is capable of multiple jumps, but we will need to overpack it with fuel and repair droids to avoid needing resupply. Our running plan is to jump it to Galantos. It will be outfitted with 2 separate messages. The first would be transmitted over a general, unscrambled channel, requesting authorization codes from a ranking official. The second would contain the actual report, about the situation here at Nzoth. Does Galantos not fall under the purview of Black Sword Command? I asked, trying to draw a picture of the oversector in my mind. I had not paid the sector organization much thought. Arrowhead Command was not a sector fleet in the same vein as Black Sword. My words appeared to resonate with Thorn at least. Is Galantos in the Black Sword, or Azure Hammer? Dorogan fell silent, watching the technician's work as he pondered his answer. It is Black Sword territory, Dorogan said after a moment's consideration. Azure starts at Calcetu, follows the Metelos spur to Coruscant, and then along the Corellian run to Zor or Zort, or something. So our plan is to send a warning about Black Sword Command, via Galantos, to Black Sword Command? I repeated slowly, the efficacy of this plan rapidly falling apart, or, we send a message to Prakith in the deep core, which is apparently in the middle of a massive power struggle and would be just as likely to attack Coruscant itself. Dorogan and Thorn fell silent, pondering this quandary now that the excitement of finding a way to communicate had faded. We all silently watched as the technicians worked, but my mind was racing with questions. If this was Tullius's intention, then what was the next step? There was nowhere we could send the probe without it being captured or lost, and certainly no way that did not warn Perret we were planning to betray him. If that was no longer a concern, then we could just forward a warning over the communications relay and die a glorious death against traitors. I shuddered somewhat at the thought. While Tullius had showcased himself to be more overzealous than previously expected, I hoped that did not extend to spending all of our lives to warn Coruscant. What was your plan? I wondered to myself, trying to get into the headspace of Rivager Tullius. What are you seeing that I cannot? Alas, nothing. Time was of the essence, and every day more of Black Sword arrived from their distant postings to rally around Perret. Tullius was trapped on Black 15, and could direct us to... Wait. Of course, I whispered, snapping my fingers before repeating louder, of course. I turned and walked toward the hangar bay shielding, looking out over the Nzoth system. At this distance, I could make out the shape of Black 15 and the distant dagger form of the Intimidator. Somewhere, the Conqueror sat, alone and surrounded by potential enemies. We were alone and surrounded by potential enemies, but even with the hopelessness of this situation, Tullius was still conspiring to escape and warn the Empire. Would you care to enlighten us to your revelation, Lieutenant? Asked Thorn. Perret has been recalling the entirety of Black Sword Command, or what he can without warning the Grand Moff. Galantos, and indeed any nearby system, are seeing a massive uptick in traffic. So many ships coming and going, who would notice a single lone probe in all of that? Plenty of people, Dorogan pointed out, every sensor officer from here to Metelos, as a start. It is not a perfect plan, I admit freely, turning again to face the two, but I was already convinced of this course, but it is our only option, short of joining this rebellion ourselves. We need only enough traitors or loyalists to ignore the probe until it reaches the edge of Coruscant's reach. From there, we are safe. In the best-case scenario, Coruscant and the ruling council receive our warning and rally their forces at Metelos or Empress Teta. The home fleet alongside the might of Azure Hammer would be more than a match for Perret's confederates when concentrated. I am not comfortable with this plan. If someone does become interested in the probe, it would not be hard to track it back to us, Dorogan said dryly, before sighing, but we don't have much in terms of alternatives. Well, if we are done catching up with Tullius's planning, the terminal is ready to record. Lieutenant, if you would. Captain Rivager Tullius. If I were to sum all of the time I spent in bars over the last 32 years, that amount would be less than what I spent in this damned club since my arrival on Black 15. Though with some introspection, that might be because I was an extremely boring person rather than any criticism of my laziness over the last couple weeks. And indeed, much of my time spent in bars was before I was technically of age, and probably shouldn't be counted as the total. All of this was to say that I did not make a habit of drinking, nor did I have any inclination to do. Unfortunately, my companion of circumstance had that as his chosen vice, partaking often and in quantity. It was surprising, as Governor Narus had always appeared to put together and conniving sort, too much so to fall into a drunken stupor. Then again, if the last few weeks had been trying for me, I could only imagine what it felt to be the man that lost his planet. I awaited a severe telling off by the time I reached Coruscant, but Narus likely had a far grimmer fate for his failings. This had the knock-on effect of greatly expanding my taste in liquor, as I stared down my third glass of some alien brandy. Unfortunately, Narus had long since abandoned identifying what he and I were drinking, opting instead to blindly accept whatever the barkeep placed in front of him. Unfortunately, I was more or less forced to suffer this quagmire with the former governor. Perret's eagerness to recruit me only went as far as joining my ships to his. Beyond my gift of a comparatively cheap bottle of liquor I had gifted him, at least according to Narus after the fact, I had rarely seen or heard from the man. With the unending stream of ships feeding into Nzoth, he had been in meetings and overseeing the incoming ships to tend to his guests. Naturally, I was of no illusion that I had suddenly become a trusted confidant of the ambitious admiral. Indeed, I suspected I was still alive solely because it would be slightly less politically expedient to just kill me and take my ships. Or so I hoped, in any case. I knew that trying to leave the system would force Perret to kill me, and some radical and desperate part of me wanted to take that chance. Perret would run wild for a time if he reached Coruscant, but the combined might of the home fleet would smash him down with a vengeance not seen since the Clone Wars. I did not want to be in the middle of that conflict, but then again I did not want to be in numerous conflicts, yet here I was. I had spent days scheming, plotting, and planning for some way out of this predicament, some manner in which I could warn the Empire or at least escape the reckoning that was coming down on all of our heads. I had no plan. No amount of scheming could get me out of Nzoth alive and appearing loyal to the greater Empire. Narus was entirely useless in that venture, and the only other partners for conversation I had were my cadre of stormtroopers, and the excitable lieutenant that introduced me to Black 15. I shuddered to wonder what my crew thought of this all. Would they realize I had no plan? What would they think if their commander was sitting, spending his days drinking and sleeping, waiting for the inevitable? There were other Grand Admirals, I spoke, only partially paying attention to the other officer's question. I only met Schick, though. Grand Admiral Oswald Schick, the man, Lieutenant something or other, breathed with an excited expression. After a moment, he continued an all too familiar line. He's the commander of the Imperial Center over Sector. Yes, I said shortly. Perhaps I was being uncharitable to the man. He hadn't done anything wrong. The situation was making my temper short, however, and he was an easy target of my unearned anger. Still, if my words had any effect, they did not show on his face, nor in his mannerisms as he leaned in to continue. Did you really? But, before he could, as if I really saved Grand Admiral Oswald Schick of the Imperial Center over Sector for the 8th time, a loud alarm klaxon filled the room. I jumped slightly in my seat, the soft groaning from Narus drawing my attention briefly before I turned my gaze to my security. A red light began to flash as I addressed one. "Trooper?" I demanded, all lethargy and self-pity forgotten in a flash. The trooper turned his head and began to speak into his helmet communicator. "Conqueror Actual, this is Guard 1." As the trooper contacted my ship to figure out if they could see what was going on, I turned to the lieutenant. His eyes were wide as he looked around, clearly not expecting the alarms either. Still, it felt prudent to ask him. "This wasn't scheduled?" "Not that I know about, sir." He responded quickly, before pausing. The alarm blared again, and in the same pattern, one the other officer recognized as his face paled. That cannot be right." "What does it mean?" Quickly, I snap, turning to grab Narus's shoulder and shake him awake. "Narus, get up. Now." "You are." "Hull breach," the officer spat out quickly, eyes darting around the room now as if expecting it to crack up any moment. But that cannot be possible." I was not given a chance to respond, to snidely tell the other officer that it was in fact possible, but several things happened at once. Behind me, I heard the door to the small corner club open up. There was a voice speaking in an alien language and a shouted warning from one of my guards. I was not given the chance to turn and see what was happening though, as the bartender had moved at that moment as well. Indeed, he appeared to have been moving before the door had opened, as he was winding his arm back with a bottle in hand. The first real emotion I had ever seen on a Yevithan was written plainly on his face, unmistakable rage. I barely had time to register what was happening before the half-full bottle of brandy Narus and I had been polishing off was flying across the room toward me. The absurdity of the action did not stop me from reflexively ducking and throwing an arm up, but I was a moment too late. The bottle hurtled toward me, landing neck first into my forearm and flipping around and slamming into my temple. I saw stars as I stumbled, losing my grip on Narus and careening into a chair. Both the chair and I hit the ground, the bottle smashing somewhere over my head. I blinked rapidly, adrenaline forcing energy back into my arms, which I propped under me to find my sudden attacker. In the time it took me to hit the ground, the Yevithan had clambered onto the bar and was crouching like he was making ready to jump. The absurdity of the situation had only just occurred to me. I was prone on the ground, Narus unconscious on the table nearby, the lieutenant gaping at me with his eyes wide, and the Yevithan now soaring through the air toward me as he jumped from the bar. I squawked in surprise, shouting something incoherent as I rolled to one side. This time I was fast enough, though I would not appreciate how lucky I was until a heartbeat later when the Yevithan hit the ground in an undignified lump. He had been aiming to sink his hands into my chest, the reason coming in the form of two large spikes protruding from under his wrist. Both were nearly a foot in length, ending in a savage tip. The bone-like weapon, which I was certain the Yevithan had not had a moment prior, scraped uselessly across the floor. I scrambled back a few paces, trying to gain distance before I got to my feet, but the Yevithan was faster on his recovery. He got to his hands and knees, turned and then launched himself at me again, screaming out hate-filled words in his native tongue. Somewhere nearby, the bark of blasters filled the room, but I was too distracted to pay any attention to that. In a more ideal circumstance, I might have pulled on some half-remembered personal protection training from my academy days, or during my mandatory weapon training seminars, but in that moment panic ruled my mind. This was not naval combat, where the threats were far and battles fought over holograms. This was close, personal, and nasty. My right arm went up, catching his left next to the wrist in a wild push and throwing that spike off target. His right plunged toward my chest, and my left hand was a moment too slow. Rather than push, I caught him by the wrist without any real plan on where to move his weight next. So, the Yevithan crashed into me fully this time. When his full weight fell on me, there was no hope of my left arm alone to stop the descent of his arm. Thankfully, my grip on him changed his direction enough that the spike did not end in my chest. Unfortunately, I was not entirely successful in redirecting him. Sharp pain chased away the last of my dizziness, the fresh agony blooming from my shoulder. I did not need to look to know that the spike had torn through muscle and skin like a knife. I let out a cry, mostly incomprehensible outside a fear of curses. My whole body jumped at the stab, but the weight of the Yevithan crashing into me kept my movement limited. The Yevithan's left arm went wide, trying to catch his weight as his right remained stuck into my shoulder, exacerbating my pain further. I had never been in a fight before. Well, that wasn't entirely true. I was a boy once. Picking fights, trying to impress girls, the lot. But schoolyard brawls did not prepare you for the real thing. Some bored Navy trooper sergeant showing you the basics of a bare-knuckle beatdown was not the real thing. I had never thought how I would react in a real life or death situation outside naval combat, safe in the knowledge that if death came for me it would be sudden and unavoidable. At this moment, through the haze of pain and panic, I was furious. After all this, months of fighting and running and surviving, and I wasn't even going to die on my own bloody bridge? My panic cry turned to a shout of inarticulate fury, my right arm untangling itself from his left and punching in the Yevithan's head where it slammed into my chest. The awkward angle made putting in strength behind the hit an impossibility, and the spiked crests hurt me far more than it did him, but it did not stop me. The Yevithan said something and tried to push himself up on his spike and free hand. The pain in my shoulder redoubled, fueling the anger I put in my second punch. With leverage and room to punch, my fist met its cheek this time. A meaty thud reached my ears, though it didn't stop him from getting somewhat up. He awkwardly kneeled over me, one arm stuck to my shoulder as the other wound up to drive the other spike into my chest again. The unwieldy length of the spike worked to my advantage this time as he had to pull his arm back some distance to aim and stab properly. My third punch was aimed at his throat rather than his head, and this was enough to destabilize him. His hand shot to his throat reflexively, and I learned that Yevithan eyes could comically bulge like a human's. My right hand shot for my holster, snapping the clasp open and drawing my blaster pistol. I tried to push its barrel into his stomach. Thunk. The Yevithan's head snapped forward and he collapsed again. My pistol was nearly thrown from my grip, but I managed to turn my hand and press the barrel into his side. The spike still embedded in my shoulder twisted and gorged deeper, but I grit my teeth and fired. Every combat and officer manual warned to never fire a blaster point blank into your target, and certainly not to do it several times in a short span. I ignored these warnings, squeezing 3 shots into the soft flesh of the Yevithan. The first was to kill him, the second was reflexive, and the third was payback from my shoulder. I could feel the heat pouring off his body where I shot him, but once I was sure he wasn't moving, I let myself collapse. My heart was racing, and after a moment I realized how much my shoulder was in agony. I turned my gaze up, seeing Narus standing over me with another empty bottle held in his hands like a bat, his eyes wide and surprised. The lieutenant was standing nearby, fumbling with his holster as he turned his horrified gaze from me to Narus. "Get this bloody thing off of me," I bit out through clenched teeth, careful not to move and disturb the spike in my shoulder. Narus gestured toward me as he stumbled back, his momentary rush of adrenaline now warring with his permanent hangover. There was only another moment of indecision before the younger officer darted over and pulled the fallen Yevithan off me. After several curses, swears to every god I could think of, and whimpering carefuls, I was sitting up. We couldn't remove the spike, not until I had some way to patch the wound, so I had a full-grown Yevithan sprawled over my lap. My left shoulder was a bloody mess, the cloth of my tunic torn and stained dark grey as my blood pooled in and around it. I could make out my skin through my torn uniform. My shoulder looked as if it had been gored by a charging animal, though perhaps that was my panic-stricken mind exaggerating the wound. I was not left wondering for long why my stormtroopers did not offer assistance, 3 of them having filed into the room and moving the corpses of another trio of Yevithans out of the doorway. The 4th was stood outside, carbine raised and scanning the adjoining hallway. "Find out what's happening," I order the lieutenant through grit teeth, gesturing to the stormtroopers. He nodded sharply and, apparently eager to make up for his inaction during my attack, scrambled over to them. I looked over at Narus, where he had collapsed into his seat. "Alive?" I asked him, none too kindly. Given the situation, I felt I could not be blamed for my annoyance. Loath though I am to admit it, he winced as the alarm klaxon blared again. The alarm and attack cannot be unrelated. I grunted my agreement but said nothing more as 2 stormtroopers approached, followed by the trailing officer. "Captain," the first one greeted, "a clone, we need to extract you to the Conqueror." "Agreed," I said, letting the anger drop from my voice as I tried to focus on the matter at hand. I looked at him, noticing a shallow score along his breastplate. "Any casualties?" 2 dead Navy commandos in the hallway, 6 Yevithans. They were armed with melee weapons, no blasters, the trooper explained, kneeling and pulling a first aid patch from his belt. "Melee weapons?" I repeated, unsure if I was more surprised at the choice of weapons or the fact that a handful of poorly armed Yevithans managed to overpower and kill 2 Navy commandos. Despite what the Stormtrooper Corps might think, those were not bad soldiers by any metric. "Slaves in the hallway," the trooper elaborated on the unasked portion of my question. "The alarms were a signal. They attacked using retractable bone-based needles in their arms." He cut my tunic at the sleeve, pulling away the cloth and exposing my arm and shoulder. I had to look away, not feeling queasy as the pain faded with the spray of a sweet-smelling numbing agent. "Should I be worried about toxins, then?" I asked, realizing belatedly that I had been stabbed by an organic weapon. "Do you feel ill?" "Not at the moment." "We should hurry to the Conqueror," the trooper said, applying a Bacta patch over my wound, a temporary solution until I could reach a medical bay. "Let's not waste any time then," I agreed once more, letting the man help me to my feet. As he began to relieve the Yevithan of his tunic, I began moving my extra equipment over to the right side of my belt. "What does the Conqueror report?" I asked, grabbing my comlink. "Communications are being scrambled, everything. We don't know how the slaves are coordinating." Despite this warning, I activated my communicator and tried to connect to the main frequency used by my section. No luck, only a faint shrieking, and indistinct voices answered me. The same was the case for other channels, even open frequencies. The stormtrooper fashioned a sling from the looted clothing, helping me put it on. It relieved some of the lingering throbbing in my shoulder, but for now, I was without an arm. Thank the stars it was my left arm, I thought, far from thankful. I can barely shoot with my right as is. "Trooper, am I correct in assuming you have a route back to the ship?" I asked, ignoring the lieutenant for the time being. "Yes, Captain." "Good, I want to be off this station." I did not know if what happened here was happening elsewhere. The still blaring alarm was sign enough something was ongoing. However, there would be nowhere safer for me and my crew than the Conqueror. And if the Yevethans want to try something, I could always flood the station with Navy troopers. See if Mob's stolen goods can be put to use. It became clear almost immediately that we were in the middle of a slave uprising. Dead Yevethans and Imperials littered our path across Black 15, the former group better armed than my would-be assassins. They had looted blasters from several sources, turning them on their former masters. Surviving Yevethans were chased off or dealt with quickly by my quartet of guards. The lack of surviving Imperials was concerning, though given the ratio of Yevethans to Imperials on the station, not unsurprising. "I don't understand, why now?" Narus asked, walking alongside me and carrying a looted blaster carbine. He was much more awake, eyes scanning the hallways frantically as he walked, when almost all of Black's sword already arrived. "Let Perret and his lot concern themselves with why," I responded sharply, glancing at a window we were approaching before turning my gaze forward again. "I want to." I passed the window and glanced out of it for a moment. I turned forward once again before stopping dead in my tracks. I backstepped, nearly crashing into a stormtrooper. The scene that distracted me was not as surprising as it ordinarily would have been, a sad sign for the state of the Empire or my perception of it. Nearby, perhaps a few thousand kilometers from Black 15, a pair of Star Destroyers were tearing away at each other. It was more than likely that their spat was related to the situation on Black 15, but it was the reason why that escaped me. Despite my words to Narus, I was very much interested in understanding what was happening, though mostly when I was safe on the Conqueror. Unless this uprising has been ongoing for a few hours, they should not have control of a Star Destroyer, I said slowly. Of course, it could be infighting within Black Sword, but the timing was too coincidental, even assuming they are just a naval complement without ground forces, that's upwards of 30,000 men. "The ships are slave-rigged," the young officer explained, joining me at the window, so it would be closer to. "The ships are slave-rigged. Much like the station, the ships would have a reduced crew of Imperials, and if the situation on those Star Destroyers was the same as the station, then that meant they would have Yevethans present." I turned sharply, facing the officer now. "You let a slave species onto a ship that is mostly automated and has a limited crew?" "I didn't do anything," the younger man said indignantly, as if blame were the main point of my words, but he hastened to continue, "And no. I mean, there might be a few Yevethans, but they are outnumbered by the crew. Besides, only the captains can activate the automation, otherwise they still require a full crew. You can't just bully a captain into giving up his control." The officer paused, glancing back out the window at the two Star Destroyers and quickly amending his statement. "Ordinarily you cannot bully a captain into giving up his control of the ship. How does the automation work?" "Code cylinders?" Narus asked, rejoining the conversation. "Yes. Each captain or ranking officer is issued an additional code cylinder that activates the slave rigging system. Except for in cases of squadron or section flagships, which goes to whoever the highest ranked officer of that group is. The Commodore or Admiral or what have you." I turned back to the ships, the answers doing little to assuage my fears, a picture of what was happening forming in my mind. With all of Black's sword being called back, the Yevithans must have seen the perfect opportunity to strike. Many of the ships were docked, with limited crews and the one person who could significantly reduce the crew cost of a given Star Destroyer within easy reach. Even still, the numbers couldn't be completely in their favor, especially with the Star Dreadnoughts in system. What about the Dreadnoughts? I asked, my voice almost a whisper as I considered a horrifying possibility. Captain? The other officer stopped mid-sentence, caught off guard by my question. I did not look at him, trying to spot one of the 3 kilometers-long ships from the window. Are the Dreadnoughts also reliant on slave rigging? Well, yes. The breath I had been holding escaped me. Where is Admiral Perret? Is he still on the station? Narus seemed to come to the same realization, his voice taking a hardened edge as he addressed the officer. Caught off guard, the man considered the question for a moment before answering. I would assume so. Him, Admiral Flynn and Commodore Ilion are currently aboard. Finally, the lieutenant caught on to the problem. Am I to assume that Admiral Flynn and Commodore Ilion would be the commanding officers of the other 2 Star Dreadnoughts currently in system? I asked slowly, but without waiting for an answer I continued, that would explain the lack of resistance. It is likely that the Yevithans are assaulting wherever Perret is hiding right now. Then we need to be out of this system before they get the chance to take that ship over, Narus muttered, looking down the way we were headed with a renewed vigor in his eyes. I opened my mouth to agree with him, to move as fast as possible toward my escape. Yet, the thought of not 1, but 3 superstar destroyers potentially in the hands of a hostile alien species, so close to the core. It irked me in the same way that Perret's planned coup did. Escaping Zoth would allow me to warn Coruscant, but if there were a chance to deny this new enemy the assets of the old, I could kill 2 Minocs with 1 stone, escape to the Conqueror and flood these hallways with Navy troopers. However, it would take time for me to reach the Conqueror and to rally a large enough force to take the station, hours at least. In that time, Perret could be killed and captured, and I would be faced with a new problem in the form of a hostile executor. I addressed the younger officer once more. What are the security measures on the station? I'm assuming there are automated defenses to make up for the lack of security personnel, droids or turrets. There are turrets, though mostly around security checkpoints. While he thought, one of the stormtroopers stepped forward. Captain, we cannot retake this station on our own. You need to extract to the Conqueror. I ignored him for a moment, focusing on the black sword officer. Try as I might, I could not remember his name. Some KX series droids, I think. Finally, he brightened, and some old destroyer droids. Right, it was a big deal back when. Destroyer droids, I interrupted him, the beginnings of a plan forming in my brain. What few of the infamous droids the station held couldn't fight all of the rebelling Yevithans on the station, but in these tight corridors they could certainly thin the herd. That could buy us the time needed to get close enough to Perret to either extract him, or at least make sure he didn't fall into Yevithan hands. Captain. The stormtrooper repeated, placing emphasis on my title. He was joined by Narus, who was staring at me like I was a madman. Tullius, have you lost your mind? If the Yevithans manage to get that dreadnought online, or any of them, then it won't matter if we make it to the Conqueror, we'll be dead. I glared at them each in turn, trying to impress upon them the severity of this situation, or the need for us to act in spite of the risk. The stormtroopers hesitated, stuck between following orders or protecting their charge. Captain, this is insane, Narus tried, but I rounded on him. Then you are welcome to go to the Conqueror, I snapped, before a new consideration reached me, though it is likely that, in failing to kill me at the bar or any other officer, they have placed guards at or around the boarding docks to catch them in their escape. In which case, we will still require the reinforcements found wherever these destroyer droids are located. And if the Yevithans have already overrun the checkpoint? Narus asked. Then we are dead men either way. I answered with a shrug that was far more flippant than how I actually felt. Despite my words, inwardly I was panicking. This whole situation was insane, but I was stuck between a collection of only bad decisions. If death was the only outcome, I would rather face it on my bridge, but if there was a chance to escape that demise, I would take it. Brooking no further argument, I turned to face the officer, who was staring at me wide-eyed. "Lead me to this security checkpoint." He nodded swiftly and took off down an adjacent hallway. Only Naruse hesitated before following. Capital ships: Conqueror, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Rivager Tullius, Lieutenant Ashka Skriold, Commander Rius Harand, Chief Wyattru Matred, Commander Sienna Ree, and Colonel Barton Raab. Intimidation: Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Commander Miljan. Escapade: Shriwar, Shri-class Battlecruiser. Cruisers: Intrepid, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Lieutenant. Dead: Steadfast, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Zanus. Viscount, Strike-class Medium Cruiser. Contester, Strike-class Medium Cruiser. Absolution, Strike-class Medium Cruiser, Lieutenant Pax. Valor, Strike-class Medium Cruiser, Commander Titus Kane. Frigates: Spite, Karak-class Light Cruiser. Loner, Karak-class Light Cruiser, Lieutenant Lobanik. Karak-class Light Cruiser. Karak-class Light Cruiser. Corvettes: Overlord, Lancer-class Frigate, Captain Forster. Justice, Lancer-class Frigate, Commander Titus. Lancer-class Frigate. Lancer-class Frigate. DP-20 Frigate. Marauder-class Corvette. Baccarat 2, IR-3F Class Light Frigate. Baccarat V, IR-3F Class Light Frigate. Chapter 10, Galantos 4. Captain Rivager Tullius. As an officer of the Imperial Navy and captain of a warship, I had been trained in the actions that need to be taken in the event of boarding. It was deemed a humorous impossibility in the old dreadnought heavy cruisers, and the mark of madness to try so against a star destroyer, but Naval High Command were nothing if not fans of redundancy. The core concepts of defending a starship were not alien to me, nor that much of those ships' interiors were designed in such a way as to remove the cover for an external force. However, in the long discussions on defending our ship, officers were given a relatively simple role: do not engage and do what your security officers say. I, much like most of the bridge crew on a star destroyer, was given the bare minimum combat training to qualify and rarely went beyond that. It was one part a cost-saving method and another for practicality. Any force that invaded a star destroyer and was successful enough to reach wherever the majority of command staff were located would be far better trained and organized than any resistance that could be offered by officers. In a rare moment of life preservation, most Imperial handbooks recommended surrender and passive resistance rather than direct intervention against an armed force. The investment the Empire made in its ranking officers was worth more than the output expending their lives could achieve, at least, in theory. The point of this lecture was to point out how I was breaking every rule and regulation at the moment. The circumstances on Black 15, and quite possibly the rest of the system, meant I should be following the directions of the better trained and drilled stormtroopers. Indeed, the junior officer would have more knowledge of where and what I should be doing. Yet, even with the understanding that I was the last person who should be leading escape efforts, I was rushing headlong into danger. Any excuse I could offer about why we would not be taking the direct route to the Conqueror only reinforced the reason why I should be listening to them, rather than the inverse. Yet, that was not the case. Rather than finding somewhere safe to hunker down until I could escape to my flagship, I was leading this motley assortment to what was our inevitable death. Then again, I thought bitterly, if I am doomed to die now to a blaster or later to a star dreadnought, why suffer the wait? It flew in the face of my earlier anger at nearly dying outside my bridge, but this course of action was only slightly less risky than rushing for the Conqueror. We hurried down the hallways of Black 15, following its featureless walls behind the overeager lieutenant. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, he appeared in remarkably high spirits. Between our running, he was excitedly discussing how we would retake the station and drive the Yevethans off, presumably into the cold vacuum of space. For my part, I offered little beyond grunts and I see to the younger man. The longer we ran the more my arm throbbed painfully. Our vanguard, one of my stormtroopers, suddenly came to a stop, throwing a fist up in a signal to stop. I nearly crashed into the lieutenant, and Narus into me, before we threw ourselves against the wall. We were joined by the rest of our company, carbines and rifles held at ready. The stormtrooper waited a heartbeat before slashing his hand to the right, a signal for two stormtroopers to break from the wall and move to the opposite side, trying to find what little cover they could. The corps soon made itself known with rapid, heavy footfalls. I swallowed, pressing even closer to the wall as I held my pistol up in my functioning hand. Narus sounded as if he were about to pass out, trying to keep his gasping as quiet as possible while the lieutenant nervously shifted this way and that. Finally, at the end of the hall, a figure darted out from an intersecting doorway. It was followed by a half-dozen more, but before I could fully register who or what they were, the stormtroopers opened fire. The leading figure didn't have time to react as a blaster bolt hit them in the chest, collapsing in short order. They were followed by the second and third, all falling in a heap in the middle of the hallway. The last in the line slipped, falling backward onto the hard durasteel floor as the remaining three turned and raised their own blasters. The following exchange was short and brutal. The Yevethans, which they had to be, could do little but blindly fire as they tried to identify targets. The seventh had scrambled back the way they came, shouting something in its alien tongue, or just shouting, I couldn't tell. The lead stormtrooper rose from his crouch and slunk along the wall toward the door, keeping pressed to the wall to cover his approach. At his signal, the two on the opposite wall slid forward as well, carbines raised and aimed with their last survivor, and any other reinforcements would be hiding. Just as they would have crossed the sight of anyone holding the corner, the leader trooper suddenly swept around and fired. He only needed to fire once, before the rear stormtrooper spoke up, his voice grizzled and no nonsense. Clear, Captain. I moved forward alongside the other two officers, and we continued. CT 8812 Tolik. The Yevethans, or Yevs as I had taken to think of them as, were growing thicker. More ambushes, or attempts therein, and heavier weapons meant we were getting close. What we would find at this security outpost was anyone's guess. Lieutenant Grab seemed to think we would source reinforcements there to retake the station. Tullius was a bit more practical, even if this plan was suicidal. Get reinforcements, bag and tag the Admiral, and then bug out before the Yevs could bring their revolution down on our heads. It was insane, but luckily for Tullius, I was used to insane. We followed the lieutenant's directions, cutting through the featureless hallways, engaging the odd stragglers. I might have been able to lead this procession myself, and cut down on the time spent deliberating, but whoever had built this station gutted it. It didn't follow standard practice of the layout of Imperial stations, seeming to place posts and stations wherever the designer thought. Hallways that should have led to an armory fed into a food court, an elevator that went up to a gun station went down to waste disposal. It was insane, and unfortunately, not the good kind. Still, we were making progress for whatever it was worth, and eventually, the bark of blaster fire that was not ours reached my ears. The higher-pitched whine of carbines was briefly silenced by the roar of a repeater, a T-21 unless my ears were deceiving me. Even that was drowned out by the roar of an E-Web blaster cannon. Someone was giving their attackers hell. We slowed before another corner, a smart decision when I peered around the durasteel. The Yevs had set up a rear guard, and these were not the rabble we had been fighting through. Plastoid armor, blaster carbines, and they carried them like they knew how to fight. Mobile cover had been thrown up, durasteel barriers with Imperial roundels still emblazoned on their front. The blasters were also stolen, E-10s, the stripped-down, less compact predecessor to the E-11 in my hands. The armor was custom, though, made to order to fit on the thin, lanky Yevethans. This entire operation was planned well in advance, if we hadn't already suspected as much. I retreat back to the group, eyes roving over our company. 4 stormtroopers, 3 officers with 1 injured, up against a dozen armed and armored defenders, bad odds. 11, maybe more. I say unnecessarily, my comrades could all access my helmet feed. It was for the benefit of the officers. The lieutenant blanched fearful, his earlier bravado forgotten. The governor shifted, fingers tightening around the unfamiliar mass of his stolen blaster, but his expression remained severe and uncompromising. A man with some spine hidden beneath the drinking, slimy demeanor. Tullius, meanwhile, appeared almost bored by the idea. He massaged his injured arm where it hung in its makeshift sling, his eyes locked on mine even through my helmet. "Get us through, trooper," he ordered, as if these numbers were merely a speed bump to his objective. It was the certainty of victory that I was familiar with in few men, those who never considered failure to be anything else but an excuse. We would get him to the security checkpoint. That was decided the moment Tullius laid out his plan. It was at my discretion as to how. That was my understanding of Tullius's words, in any case. He rarely let anything escape that max of cool indifference he put up at all times. I merely nodded my head and reached around my back, pulling the thermal detonator from my utility belt. "Yes, sir." I laid out my plan of attack. Tullius would remain behind. He was a poor shot from what I had seen and injured besides. The lieutenant was left to guard him, being only slightly more reliable than the clipped captain. Only Narus would play his part in the attack, properly sobered up now and prepared to fight. Knelt at the corner, I quickly tapped in my access code before twisting its timer. 6 ticks, 6 seconds. At the press of one final button, the detonator whined to life. No words were exchanged between the makeshift strike team. I leaned around the corner and threw the detonator underhand toward the defenses. 1. 2. TK 8770 and CT 1142 pushed around the corner, going wide to the other end of the hallway. Credit to the Yevs, they reacted quickly, crying out in their native tongue and bringing their blasters up. Half went for cover while the others began firing. 3. I pushed the corner next, keeping low so as to allow CT-0900 and Narus clearance to fire over me. My first bolt found one of the Yevs out of cover, its form crumpling. A second fell to a blaster from the other side of the hallway. 4. 5. One of the Yevs that made it to cover peeked out and fired at me. Its shot went wide, but I could hear it sizzle in the air as it passed my helmet. We were out of cover, in the open and now facing an entrenched and aware enemy. Any longer than that 6th second, and we might have started taking casualties. 6. Thermal detonators were loud, flashy, and damned dangerous. However, unlike older fragmentation or plasma grenades, the explosion only went a certain distance around the grenade, effectively vaporizing everything within that range. Anything beyond would be fine, relatively speaking. So, when the grenade exploded, the leftmost barrier simply vanished. It was joined by the 2 Yevs behind it, a third still standing out in the open, and the corpse of a fourth, alongside the floor and wall. It was a small mercy that we were deeper in the station, though the sudden explosion sent a panic alarm to scream through the station, its central computers recognizing that someone had detonated something. The remaining Yevethans were thrown off balance, largely unaffected by the detonator outside the initial explosion of the grenade. Their momentary lapse in attention was to our benefit. I surged forward, the familiar thud of footfalls at my back telling me someone was following me in. I had my blaster raised as I ran, the heads-up display doing the rest of the work. A separated Yev lurched backwards as I hit him in 2 shots, his neighbor taking a bolt for his trouble as well. We broke the Yevethans' cover, finding the remainder huddled there and trying to get their bearings. Still, they reacted amiably and turned their blasters on me. I skid to a stop not a second too early, as bolts screamed through the space in front of me. My helmet screamed warnings, but it was a calm professionalism that I raised my blaster and fired into the crowded group. My neighbor, the familiar white of plastoid telling me they were a trooper, joined me. The nearest 2 Yevethans were hit several times in the spray, toppling backwards into their neighbors. Another took an accidental bolt to his head, leaving only one to be caught under the press of bodies. I did not give it the chance to get out or raise its blaster. I ran up and fired twice, both headshots. I didn't take a moment to realize our victory, racing back to my wall and slamming up against it. CT0900, and I crept forward to the next corner. I had only just sat back on my haunches when a Yev came barreling around the corner, blaster held loosely in one hand as it peered toward the carnage. It wasn't given time to react as I fired my blaster up into its face. The alien's body jumped before it collapsed in a heap, its death earning me alarmed cries from around the corner. I leaned back as a flurry of gleaming crimson bolts hurtled past my cover, some brightly flashing as they met Durasteel. "Move cover up," I barked into our private comms, signaling with a hand for the other two stormtroopers to get moving. Soon, the two troopers hobbled into sight, carrying the surviving barricade to our position. They turned it to face the hostile force before pushing it across the floor, the shriek of metal on metal briefly drowning out the bark of blaster fire. TK 8770 had to scramble behind the barricade when a bolt slammed an inch from his head, partially blackening his helmet with the resulting flash. The two, now hidden behind the barricade, pushed against its rear section with their backs, slowly moving the shield until it was flush with my corner. CT0900 raced around me and to the far side of the shield, peering out and taking a potshot down the hallway before returning to his cover. I slid forward a pace, placing the barrel of my carbine in the gap between the corner and barrier, getting my first view of the siegeworks, nearly triple the number of Yevethans that held a line of Durasteel barriers, the center of their formation taken up by a heavy E-web turret. Several had turned to face us, returning fire as they tried to press to the walls or drop to the floor. I turned my blaster and shot the operator of the heavy cannon in the back, watching as it crumpled and dragged the barrel up. Its roar died as the Yevethan fell, the silence filled with the comparatively tamer bark of repeaters. I was given my first view of the security checkpoint beyond the Yevethan barricades. The hallways opened up into a larger atrium, tables surrounding a two-storied structure at its center. A catwalk surrounding the second floor was covered in carbon scoring, with its defenders' black and white helmets peering over and taking potshots. The resulting engagement was short-lived and one-sided. The Yevethans, for all their preparation and firepower, were caught out of cover. Those who held their positions were gunned down by my men, and those who charged were shot in the back by the enterprising repeater at the security checkpoint. As the defenders retreated to the other side of their makeshift fortress, to engage Yevs pushing from that corridor, we were allowed in at the ground level. "Move it." A Navy commando barked as we filled, holding the door against any enterprising Yevs. What greeted us was a war zone or the aftermath of one. Dozens of men and women littered the floors, areas where desks once sat now cleared to allow the injured or dead space to lay. Navy troopers, those either too badly hurt or otherwise unable to hold the line, stood guard at sealed blast doors and shuttered windows. Nervous and tired eyes turned to us as we arrived, defeat permeating in the air. The few hours this rebellion had been occurring had driven these men and women to the brink. And then Captain Tullius entered. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded, his voice brooking no argument despite looking like he belonged among the injured more than he did standing alongside the defenders. Tullius's words roused some attention from the crowd, though most returned to their tasks once they realized we weren't Yevethans. One trooper, half his face buried in bandages, pointed upstairs, speaking with an agonized voice. "Captain Nellos, upstairs." "Lieutenant, with me," Tullius said, before marching over to the stairs, Grab chasing close behind him. After a moment of consideration, I let out a sigh. Best to go with Tullius, me and my men would probably be instrumental in whatever his plan was. I pointed the other three to an empty space of wall where the resting or dying were not, before passing a wheezing Narus on my way to the stairs. The top was markedly emptier of humans, though weapons were arrayed haphazardly on tables or against walls. As I reached the top of the stairs, the door to the catwalk outside opened and allowed a Navy trooper inside. The man lugged in a repeating blaster, its barrel smoking and still red from the heat. He dropped it haphazardly on a table and grabbed its neighbor before rushing back outside, silencing the cacophony of battle with the hiss of the door. Tullius was easily enough to be located in the sparse crowd, his straight and tireless posture on an island in the sea of exhaustion and battle-weary officers. He faced off against another naval officer adorned in that grey uniform, seated and hunched in a chair looking far less put together than Tullius. Tullius had evidently gotten straight to business, as I walked into hearing range to the other captain responding. "Cannot give you the droids. Even if I had access to them, those droids may well be all that stands between us and annihilation." The man slammed a meaty fist on his adjacent table, and the data pads he was poring over jumped at the motion. Tullius was unperturbed. "You have neither the men nor firepower to hold off the numbers available to your enemy, Captain. Once the Yevethans mobilize the brunt of their manpower, they will overrun you with ease. We need to strike decisively, while they are unbalanced." "Unbalanced? Perhaps you have failed to notice, Captain, but the only ones unbalanced here are us. The Yevethans overran everything on this side of the shuttle bays. My orders are clear: hold this position until we are reinforced by the other stations. There won't be any reinforcements." This was not an isolated rebellion. The Yevethans seized a considerable percentage of the fleet. Even if the local garrison is successful, we will not be alive to appreciate it. I glanced at Grab where he stood off to one side, eyes bouncing from officer to officer with a concerned expression. "The Intimidator will clear the scales, and that is not counting assistance from the other, Admiral Perret, alongside." Tullius paused, then snapped the fingers on his good hand and pointed at Grab. To his credit, the lieutenant quickly stepped in. "Admiral Flynn and Commodore Ilion? Yes, them, they are all aboard this station right now." The other captain froze at that, his exhaustion vanishing in a flash as his expression became one of deep concentration. He couldn't have been silent for more than 5 seconds before he spoke, his voice harsh and short. "The Yevethans would know this. That is the only reason we haven't been overrun, yes. The majority of their forces are likely assaulting Perret's position. I knew their numbers seemed too small, damned slaves." The other captain cursed before turning his gaze back to Tullius. "Perret is our priority. What do you need?" "Whatever you can spare, and more besides." And like that, the two men were on the same wavelength. A cold professionalism I only ever really saw in stormtrooper officers, one born in this instant out of desperation. "My men are depleted as is," the other officer gestured to a chair, inviting Tullius to sit. "Even if I were to put every injured officer on the line, we are still running on borrowed time. I would need only a handful of your Navy commandos. A security officer can hold the line well enough. So long as we have those droids." "How can you be so sure? The Yevethans have numbers." Tullius paused and then turned to me, his eyes staring expectantly up into my helmet. Realizing now that my presence was fortuitous and expected, I stepped forward. "The Yevs are driven, but they're not well drilled. Poor reaction times. I wager these NavSec troopers have more discipline than they do, and their armor is negligible. Shock troopers were ideal for fighting that sort of enemy, and loath though I was to admit it, Navy commandos were technically shock troopers. Disorganized militias and fanatical rebels did not often have the training to withstand such aggression. Typically, I thought, slightly bitterly, to Hoth. The rebels, capital Resh, had the arms, fanaticism, and discipline on par with the regular army trooper corps, if not surpassing them. From what I had seen so far, the Yevs did not compare. They might have some elite units hidden away somewhere, but they weren't sending their best to take this outpost. "We don't have the droids," the other officer admitted at last, shaking his head. "Follow." We took the stairs back down to the main lobby and then a service elevator to the floor below that. An armory, or what was left of it seeing as the majority of the equipment was upstairs, filled the room and ran along the circular walls. A wall bisected the room in half, dull durasteel framing a thick blast door. The room was not devoid of life. 4 men in naval engineer jumpsuits and a 5th in the familiar black of an Imperial gunner crowded the far wall. 2 were at the door itself, faces covered by shields as they worked at the door with torches, overseen by the gunner. At our approach, the black uniformed officer turned and saluted. He quickly explained the situation. "We've been at it since they arrived," he yelled, jerking a finger back at the engineers, "but it's slow going. These blast doors weren't meant to be opened without a passcode, and all we've got are plasma torches. A glance at the door could tell us that. My helmet automatically dimmed the bright flashes of plasma cutting away at durasteel. The standing man was moving down the left side of the door while the kneeling moved up the right, hardly safe, but something told me safety was the furthest thing from their minds. "I'll assume you do not have access?" Tullius asked the other captain, who shook his head. Major Dean, who unfortunately did not report to his station when the alarm went up, would have access. "The armory sergeant is lying out there somewhere, dead." "Where can we get fusion cutters?" Tullius asked, expression grim. "Engineering, but no way to get over there." "Yevethans." "How long?" the other captain asked. 2 hours, maybe 3. "I've got my men on shifts, but we've only got the 2 torches." "Does Admiral Perret have 2 to 3 hours? Grab asked nervously, his tone uncertain. He was asked to repeat his question before the other captain, "Oh Cap, I decided, until I learned his name," responded. "He is not in some pleasure hall," Oh Cap said with a dismissive wave of his hand, leading us back up to the main level and away from the sound. "The largest concentration of security forces will be around the administrative sector. Even disorganized, it will take the Yevethans time to fight through that mass and reach him. Let's hope, for all of our sakes, that is the case, Captain Hoke. We should begin planning our assault immediately." The now identified Hoke lost his momentary derision to give Tullius a solemn nod. A holotable in the main room was our destination, a floating hologram for whatever local service provider hovering over the table. "Network down, we apologize for the inconvenience." Flickered in place of the logo periodically, before the whole thing vanished under Hoke's manipulations. A scale model of the station flickered to life, the outpost flashing green. "These are the administrative offices," Hoke explained, pointing out a patch of rooms to one side of the station. The map labeled its starboard. A single long hallway led up to the level, one way in or out of the station heart. A reminder of the station's formerly military designation, and one that could be well defended by security forces, or a slaughter if already taken by the enemy. Already, I running simulations through my head on how I would want to take that office, current resources in mind. It was a grim situation. My recommendation would have been to push a bomb into that hallway and let the void handle the rest. I suspected that was not what the captains wanted, at least not if there was still a chance to save Perret. Denying control of that star dreadnought to the Yevs was the end goal, but it was clear Tullius would prefer having it under ours. "Unfortunately, this planning is not my domain." Tullius almost sounded genuinely annoyed at the idea, taking a seat and fiddling with his sling. "Trooper?" It took me a second to realize who he was speaking to, only a moment before his dull gaze turned in my direction. He was joined by Hoke, Grab, and what other officers had wandered over. I swallowed thickly before stepping forward, leaning over the hologram as plans threw themselves together in my mind. "I will lead a strike team to the administrative offices, alongside the droids," I said after a moment, quickly detailing the beginnings of this operation. "We will hit them fast and hard, right down the center. If there are still friendly Imperial forces in the offices, we'll link up with them and retreat to the docking bay." It wasn't so much a plan as it was a statement of intent, but there wasn't much I could do here without more information on Yev forces. Despite this, Tullius was nodding slowly, running his good hand along his chin. "Not back here?" Hoke asked, alarmed. The source of his concern was showcased by the muffled bark of blaster rifles outside. "No, while we are moving on the offices, you will be extracting to the Conqueror, or whatever other friendly ships are still there." "Good," Tullius agreed, standing up and turning to Narus. "Narus, you go with the second team, my security teams will recognize you at least." "You too, Lieutenant." "While I'm sure you're going to the Conqueror, sir." Tullius turned and looked at me as I spoke, the look of bemused surprise on his face almost funny. I quickly continued before the man could get another word in, "Just my men and the Navy commandos, shock troopers. Regular infantry wouldn't keep up. Also, you're injured." Tullius then turned his gaze to his busted shoulder, as if only now remembering that he was injured. His expression remained unchanging, but I had to wonder if there wasn't some disappointment in his eyes. Tullius seemed the sort to throw himself headfirst into danger. "Captain Rivager Tullius! Contact!" a voice cried, and the air was nearly knocked out of my lungs as a Navy trooper slammed into me. My injured arm, properly dressed now, screamed in protest as I hit the wall. I tried to raise my arm and catch myself, but that was an even worse decision. I fought to keep my screams under control, all while running through every curse and insult I knew in my mind. The contact, as it were, turned out to be a warband of Yevithans wandering the halls, parading the remains of mutilated Imperials like trophies. Officers of some note, based on their uniforms, though they had all been concerningly stripped of their code cylinders. Limbs were another unfortunate casualty, it seemed, as the Yevithans gathered the means to seize control of the fleet. One had to wonder how long the Yevithans had been planning this little operation, and how much of it was going to plan. There appeared to be some overarching intelligence behind it all, but the Yevithan rebels themselves were almost operating at random. Assaults on low-importance positions, groups wandering halls by themselves or in small groups. Unfortunately, asking the Yevithans themselves was out of the question. What few survived the hail of blaster bolts from a small army of injured and paranoid Navy troopers were not very forthcoming. Most could speak basic, and were very creative in their insults and in describing what horrors they would commit on us and their families. Pleasant chaps, all around. The niggling part of my mind that recoiled at this all, that sought to place blame at the feet of the tormentors rather than the tormented, was ignored. "Captain Tullius!" A voice called me to the front of the parade, pulling me from my thoughts. I grumbled something under my breath before straightening my uniform and pushing ahead. Troopers moved aside, confusion bleeding into distress the closer I got. Hogue stood alongside the naval engineers, staring out the window of an airlock barring our path. A shiver of concern raced its way up my back, but I stepped forward all the same. "Captain Hogue, what's—" He stepped aside, face pale as snow, as he gestured hopelessly through the transparent steel window. The cause for his concern was revealed and gave me a moment of pause. Beyond this door was where the docking bay was supposed to be, that much I could remember. The umbilical bridge connecting the station to my ship should have been a few dozen paces forward from here. What greeted me was the destroyed exterior wall of the room beyond, and the shredded remains of the docking umbilical to the Conqueror. A bomb of some kind would have been my guess, detonated where the ship and station met. I could see from here that the umbilical was drifting away from the Conqueror, cut free now that it was entirely useless. The bodies of what men weren't sucked out into the empty void floated where they got stuck, the terror of their last moments frozen on their faces. Some of the Navy troopers out there wore appropriated army equipment, mobsmen. My men. All at once, pity was the further thing from my mind. Capital ships. Conqueror, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Rivager Tullius, Lieutenant Ashka Skriold, Commander Rius Harand, Chief Wyatt Drew Matred, Commander Sienna Ree, and Colonel Barton Mob. Intimidation, Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, Commander Miljan. Escapade, Shriwar, Shri-class Battlecruiser, Lieutenant Commander Thorne. Cruisers. Intrepid, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Lieutenant. Dead. Steadfast, Victory I-class Star Destroyer, Captain Zanus. Viscount, Strike-class Medium Cruiser. Contester, Strike-class Medium Cruiser. Absolution, Strike-class Medium Cruiser, Lieutenant Pax. Valor, Strike-class Medium Cruiser, Commander Titus Kane. Frigates. Spite, Carrack-class Light Cruiser. Loner, Carrack-class Light Cruiser, Lieutenant Lobanik. Dugnad, Carrack-class Light Cruiser, Lieutenant Axel Allberg. Carrack-class Light Cruiser. Corvettes. Overlord, Lancer-class Frigate, Captain Forster. Justice, Lancer-class Frigate, Commander Titus. Lancer-class Frigate. Lancer-class Frigate. DP-20 Frigate. Marauder-class Corvette. Baccarat II, IR-3F-class Light Frigate. Baccarat V, IR-3F-class Light Frigate.